Welcome to Preserve, Protect, and Defend the Soul of America. Today, we examine the story of American vaping. It is a timeline of institutional breakdown, tracking how the structures designed to protect public health buckled under the weight of corporate strategy and bureaucratic delay. In the spring of 2018, high school principals across the country began confiscating a device they didn't recognize. Students were using it in classrooms and locking themselves in bathrooms to inhale from it. To most parents and teachers, the rectangular metal object looked exactly like a USB flash drive. That gap between the harmless appearance of the device and the highly addictive nicotine delivery system hidden inside was a deliberate feature of its design. The regulatory shelter protecting this new device had been constructed decades earlier. Tobacco cultivation financed the earliest American colonies and eventually embedded itself deep within regional economies. That deeply rooted commercial power allowed tobacco companies to manufacture scientific uncertainty and shield themselves from the consumer safety regulations applied to nearly every other product on the market. Congress finally granted the FDA statutory authority over tobacco in 2009, but the law required the agency to draft a deeming rule to officially extend that authority to newer products like e-cigarettes. The drafting process took 5 years. During that half-decade of administrative processing, a new, entirely unregulated market began to grow in plain sight. The designers who stepped into that regulatory blind spot were not legacy tobacco executives. They were 2 Stanford University product design students working on their master's thesis. They applied the disruption ideology of Silicon Valley to nicotine delivery, building a sleek, aluminum-bodied electronic alternative to combustible cigarettes. The government moved at bureaucratic speed, while the technology sector moved at market speed. That difference in velocity created a multi-year regulatory void. Millions of adolescents would walk directly into it. This chemical schematic illustrates the breakthrough that made mass youth adoption possible. E-cigarettes originally used freebase nicotine, which produced an intensely harsh throat hit at high doses, a physical signal that warned inexperienced users away. By combining nicotine with benzoic acid, engineers created nicotine salts. The harshness disappeared. A naive user could now inhale deeply without coughing. The smooth delivery mechanism allowed for extreme concentrations. A single JUUL pod contained roughly 59 milligrams of nicotine per milliliter. The liquid inside that small piece of plastic held the pharmacological equivalent of an entire pack of combustible cigarettes, offering no physical warning of the massive dose being consumed. The company's Vaporized campaign framed the device as an aspirational tech and lifestyle product. Internal documents produced in response to subpoenas reveal the brand utilized Instagram influencers with young audiences, staged school-based presentations, and heavily promoted flavors like mango and mint specifically chosen for their adolescent appeal. Because the vapor was nearly odorless and visually dissipated within seconds, teenagers could use the devices undetected in schools and homes. The behavior cascaded through adolescent social networks. Once the stigma and heavy smell of cigarette smoke were removed from the equation, social friction vanished, and addiction rates accelerated. By December 2018, the world's largest tobacco company, Altria, took notice. They invested $12.8 billion for a 35% stake in JUUL. Altria had spent a century studying how to reach young people, and their massive financial commitment validated the data showing massive, youth-driven growth in the e-cigarette market. The surge in youth vaping resulted from the deliberate, engineered intersection of optimized nicotine chemistry and digital marketing tactics aimed at a highly vulnerable demographic. Between 2017 and 2019, FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb publicly acknowledged the youth vaping crisis and issued warning letters to retailers. Yet the foundational regulatory tool available to the agency, requiring manufacturers to submit to pre-market review to prove their products protected public health, remained unenforced. Flavored pods stayed on retail shelves. Then, in the summer of 2019, emergency rooms in the Midwest began admitting teenagers with severe, mysterious lung injuries. Patients presented with low blood oxygen and CT scans resembling chemical burns. By the fall, the CDC was tracking thousands of hospitalizations and dozens of deaths under the acronym EVALI. Public health agencies and media outlets quickly conflated the separate issues. Press conferences blamed vaping broadly, leaving the public terrified of all e-cigarettes. In reality, investigations confirmed the outbreak was caused almost entirely by illicit black market cannabis cartridges cut with a toxic oil called vitamin E acetate. It was not by legal, FDA-regulated nicotine vapes. Reacting to the undifferentiated public panic, the FDA announced new restrictions in January 2020 targeting flavored, closed-system pods. However, the policy contained a massive structural loophole. It largely exempted single-use disposable devices. Manufacturers instantly pivoted. A flood of cheap Chinese-manufactured disposable vapes entered the United States. To stall for time, domestic and international companies flooded the FDA with 6.7 million pre-market tobacco product applications, entirely overwhelming the agency's review staff of 850 employees. With federal regulators paralyzed by millions of applications, individual states stepped in. California voters passed a referendum banning flavored vapes, while Texas banned devices manufactured in China outright. The country fractured into a patchwork of local regulations, where a device featuring candy-like flavors might be legal in one county and contraband a few miles away. The indiscriminate panic surrounding the 2019 lung injuries blocked any chance of a nuanced regulatory framework. The resulting policies frightened adult smokers away from a potentially less harmful alternative to combustible cigarettes, while failing entirely to stop a new wave of disposable, fruit-flavored vapes from reaching young people. When the FDA finally began issuing marketing denial orders against millions of these products, the e-cigarette industry borrowed the legacy tobacco playbook. They sued. Well-funded litigation teams systematically challenged the agency in court, relying on the sheer complexity of administrative law to keep unapproved products on shelves while the cases dragged on. The stalling strategy hit a wall in April 2025. A unanimous Supreme Court upheld the FDA's denial orders, legally vindicated the agency's strict evidentiary standards. The court confirmed the FDA had the clear authority to ban flavored liquids if manufacturers could not prove the benefit to adult smokers outweighed the obvious appeal to youth. But legal authority does not guarantee political support. Following a change of administration at the White House in 2025, the Department of Health and Human Services executed sweeping reductions in force. The FDA office responsible for drafting tobacco regulations was gutted, and the federal infrastructure dedicated to youth nicotine prevention was aggressively dismantled. By May 2026, the FDA abruptly authorized the sale of fruit-flavored vapes for the first time in American history. Internal reporting revealed the approval was forced through under direct presidential pressure, following aggressive lobbying from vaping industry representatives. 1 week after the decision, the FDA commissioner resigned. This flowchart maps out the structural failure at the center of the crisis, the medicalization trap. Regulators forced novel nicotine devices into a binary choice. If classified as prescription smoking cessation aids, the clinical trial requirements are too strict to survive. If classified as consumer tobacco products, the market floods with unauthorized variations. Congress has never built a middle ground framework specific to recreational consumer nicotine. The data from mid-2026 shows a complicated reality. While overall teen vaping numbers have dropped significantly from their peak, the use of oral nicotine pouches among high schoolers has doubled. Furthermore, the adolescents who still vape are showing record high rates of daily addiction intensity. The target is constantly shifting. The decade-long fight over e-cigarettes exposes a critical vulnerability in the American regulatory system. Hard-won progress built on scientific consensus, legal battles, and public health advocacy can be dismantled instantly by the political directives of a single administration, leaving adolescent brain chemistry at the mercy of regulatory chaos. This analysis is based on the research presented in Vapor and Void, the American Vaping Epidemic, the FDA's regulatory paralysis, and what the e-cigarette experience reveals about the structural limits of public health governance. To read the full study of institutional failure and corporate impunity, you can purchase the book on Amazon using the link in the description below. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to the channel for more in-depth investigations into the policies shaping our world.